Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me today, and thanks for Katya's presentation too. That was super helpful. I am going to focus on, I'm going to introduce you to the new clinic. I'll do that at the end of my presentation, and then I'm just going to deal with two other issues impacting refugees, border and COVID, and what's happening at the Refugee Protection Division, and a bit about appeals and judicial review. So, first, the Refugee Protection Division. So Katya helpfully explained the new process for making a claim, and things are a little bit different at the Refugee Board once you go for your hearing. So the Refugee Board kind of suspended its operations. They canceled a bunch of hearings for a number of months, but they are now back to scheduling hearings. And so, if clients had hearings that had previously been scheduled, they may be now being called, or their lawyers may be now being called to reschedule. And there's kind of two options that are available. One is the remote hearing pilot project, and then the other is the in-person hearing, but I'll put in-person in quotes because it's not the in-person kind of hearing that we are generally been used to. So first, the remote hearing pilot project. So that is where first, that's completely by consent. So people have to agree to want to participate in this pilot project. And how it works is that nobody goes to the IRP building itself, and instead they connect through Microsoft Teams to a platform where the hearing is going to be held. So the claimant, the lawyer, the interpreter, and the member. So they would all be there on the screen, and the hearing is done completely remotely. So like I said, everyone has to consent to being able to do that. People have to make sure that they have access to reliable technology and a space that is secure and that they feel comfortable talking about, obviously, extremely confidential issues. So some people are doing those at their lawyers' offices. And, that's just started in the last month, and it's likely going to be extended. I know I think it was supposed to go until September, but they're continuing to schedule hearings November, December. So that project is ongoing. The in-person hearings are also happening. You can see in this picture, like, the IRB has put some plexiglass. I haven't actually been in the building since COVID, but they have put this plexiglass barriers in front of where the claimant usually sits and the interpreter. But as it is now in Vancouver, the members are not in the hearing room. So they are connecting by video conference. So even when we say in-person hearing, the member will be by video conference. As I understand, the interpreter is often by phone, and the claimant and counsel are in a hearing room together. There are all sorts of requirements in terms of like a questionnaire in terms of your health conditions prior to coming in, and then the requirement to be masked throughout the building, but not when giving testimony or providing submissions. So, and some people don't feel comfortable going into the building in person and are requesting to do remote hearing instead. obviously this will mean that they can do, there's, there already was a backlog for hearings, but now there have been a number of hearings canceled. There's reduced use of hearing rooms. So, there's definitely delays in getting people's hearing dates. The other thing is there's a new practice notice. So the Refugee Protection Division and all the different divisions actually at the IRB have issued different practice notices because of COVID and how they've changed some of the normal practices. So for Refugee Protection Division, one of the one change is that you're no longer required to bring in original, like normally you'd have to bring in the original BOC with the signature, your original documents. Now you're told to keep those documents, but you're not required to bring them to the hearing unless a member has asked for them specifically. Children under 12 are no longer required to go to present themselves at the hearing. The requirements around you don't need to have the rules were you in terms of having to cancel a hearing for a medical issue. You needed a medical certificate. You're no longer required to provide a medical certificate. You don't in fact need signatures on some of the forms and documents. The requirement for signatures has been waived. And now the Refugee Board is accepting documents by e-post, which Katyana talked about, but also by email. And they've expanded how many documents you can send by fax, and then they still take documents by mail as well. So those are, some of the changes at the Refugee Board. In terms of appeals and judicial reviews, one thing Katyana mentioned, you can challenge a decision. If you get a negative decision from the Refugee Board, you can challenge it. Most people will have access to the Refugee Appeal Division, which is another division of the Immigration Refugee Board. And there you can potentially file some new evidence, and there's strict timelines in order to file the initial notice, but those and right now the timelines for the Refugee Appeal Division have started again. So there was a long suspension period because of COVID. So they went back and they said any decision from January 1st until August 18th, the timelines don't apply. But now they've started again. So if you did receive a decision during that period, the 15 days after decision receipt, so now from August 18th, is applying. And then it's another 15 days to file your arguments and your new evidence, but you can request extensions to file arguments and new evidence. Judicial review, you can challenge a decision from the Refugee Appeal Division. So if you get a negative decision from the Appeal Division, you can challenge it in federal court, and generally no new evidence is allowed there. The court's just looking at whether or not the decision maker made a mistake based on the evidence that they had. And there again, there's a strict timeline. Federal court also had a huge suspension period, but they're back to normal timelines applying. So I guess what I would say is if you have a client that has a negative refugee decision or a negative appeal decision, it's really important that they speak to a lawyer as soon as possible. And if they have passed the deadlines, it might still be worth talking to a lawyer, especially given the fact that there is a lot of these suspension periods. There may be reasons why they weren't able to file in time. So best thing is to, as soon as you get a decision, to get an opinion about trying to challenge it. yeah, both for federal court and for the Refugee Appeal Division. Okay, the border. So yeah, a lot of changes because of COVID and the border that affect all sorts of people that are trying to come to Canada, but I'm going to just focus on the border and refugees. So, of course, there are new restrictions on who can come to Canada. As Katiana said, if you do arrive by air and you're here, you can make a refugee claim, and she's outlined the process that you would go through now to do that, either at the port of entry or by email. Of course, there's going to be less people that are even have been able to make it here because of the increased restrictions by air. But if they manage to get here, then they can make a claim just as they had before at a port of entry by air. Now, the land border with the US is more complicated. So, and there's, I'm just trying to think in my head how to go through with it, because I put down here like order in council with the US, Safe Third Country Agreement, and Budget Implementation Act, because there's a few kinds of things that have happened because of COVID and before that all impact a person's ability to make a claim at the land border or crossing into Canada irregularly. So, I mean, I should say this is something that people, it's a bit complicated. You may need someone might need legal advice in trying to figure this out. But I'm just going to kind of tell you generally what are some of the changes. So, Safe Third Country Agreement has been in place for now, I think it was 2000, I want to say 2003. That it first, I might be wrong about that date, but early 2000s, that it first came into play. And that's our agreement with the United States, where we're basically saying the United States is a safe place for refugees. And so if a refugee is coming in through the United States at the land border, they can be found ineligible to make a refugee claim and directed back to the United States. There are exceptions to the Safe Third Country Agreement, and one of the main exceptions is if you have a family member in Canada. The Safe Third Country Agreement was just recently found unconstitutional because there are a number of groups that challenged it and said, how can we continue to have this agreement when we know that the United States is in fact not safe for refugees? Federal court just found it unconstitutional like a few weeks ago, but the impact of that was suspended for a period of 6 months for the government to decide what to do. The government has now announced on Friday that they are going to be appealing that decision and are going to continue to argue that the Safe Third Country Agreement is fair. So for now, the Safe Third Country continues to operate. What makes things more complicated is because of COVID, we have agreements with the United States where people are not allowed anymore to just travel from the United States to Canada. And one of those restrictions is also on refugees, and only those who fit within the Safe Third Country Agreement are allowed to come in, within the exception of the Safe Third Country Agreement, are allowed to come in to make a refugee claim. So prior, when people were crossing irregularly, so not at a land border, if they managed to get into Canada, even if they were intercepted right in coming into Canada, they would still be allowed to make a refugee claim. That's no longer the case. That's not to say if somebody managed to get in somehow to Canada, if later they went and tried to make a refugee claim, they're not ineligible at that point. It's just that it's the coming in regularly and being intercepted near the border that could cause someone to be directed back to the US, where they wouldn't have been prior to COVID. It's because of this new agreement with the United States. The only exception is for refugee claimants is if you go to the land border and you fit within an exception of Safe Third Country Agreement, the main one being like as an unaccompanied minor, or you have some family member in Canada. I put Budget Implementation Act just to make it more complicated, because the last year, in the government's massive Budget Implementation Act, they had put in provisions that changed that made changes to eligibility to make a refugee claim. And one of the changes is if you'd made a refugee claim in one of the countries that Canada has information sharing agreements with, one of them being the United States, so US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. So if someone has made a claim in the US, they are ineligible to make a claim in Canada, to have a claim before the Refugee Board, and they would now be given a PRA instead, with the opportunity to have an interview with a PRA officer instead of a hearing with the Immigration Refugee Board. The reason I raise it here is that people need to be careful and think about that in terms of exceptions to the Safe Third Country Agreement, because if somebody fit within the exception, because they had a family member in Canada, but they had made a claim in the US, they could be found ineligible for a hearing before the Refugee Board and be directed back. So, I mean, the overall point is that the land border has become more complicated. The crossing has become more complicated for refugees, and there are a number of things to think about when someone's deciding to do that. Okay, and then, so yeah, that's kind of the main things I wanted to kind of add on to Katya's presentation about changes and COVID and refugees. And now I'm just going to spend this last bit of time talking about our new clinic. So the Immigration Refugee Legal Clinic started in April 2020. You know, I've been practicing immigration refugee law for many years now, and I've always wanted there to be a legal clinic because I think that there are a lot of gaps in service. And so one of the things, you know, one of our main goals is to try and you know, serve people who are tending to fall through the cracks in the general framework of the traditional legal aid system. So we're jointly created by the province and the Law Foundation of BC. So what happened, I mean, some of you may have been around before, you know, 2002, and may remember that there were legal clinics in BC. Those were, and there was in fact even a refugee legal clinic. Those were cut in 2002, and there really haven't been legal clinics since then. The government ordered this external review of legal aid services, and one of the last year, or maybe the year before now, and one of the recommendations was to establish a refugee legal clinic to take on urgent and complex cases to supplement the current legal aid system. And so what happened is the province decided to fund, through the Law Foundation of BC, 7 legal clinics across the province by funding a staff lawyer and a legal assistant. So there are 4 new poverty law clinics across the province. There is a specialty disability law clinic, a specialty tenant legal clinic. I'm just thinking if I'm forgetting another one. There's 4, and then we're the Immigration Refugee Legal Clinic. No, that's right. So 4 poverty, and then 3 specialized. So the 3 specialized are disability, tenant, and then us. And we are housed at Welcome House at Immigrant Services Society, but we are an independent program, and our mandate is province-wide. So, and we are the only legal clinic specializing in immigration and refugee matters in BC. So our vision is that, as I said, we're wanting to try and serve those that are tending to fall through the cracks of our legal system and provide them with excellent, respectful, and caring legal advice and representation. These are our guiding values. So legal excellence, accessibility, and respect and care. And then this is what we do. So I should say, that's it's a broad kind of mandate, and we have, you know, we've kind of set out a framework of what we want to do, but we are also quite small. So there's myself, there's Tian Tran, who is a staff lawyer at the clinic, and we also have a legal assistant, Jinhee Lee, who's just actually heading on mat leave and being replaced by Omar Chu. And so there's essentially 3 people, but we're full-time. And and so what we're doing is we can offer legal advice and information. And we do those through consultations or summary advice appointments. So if somebody has an immigration and refugee legal issue, they can contact the clinic, and if they meet the financial, if they're low income, we're able to provide free advice. They can talk to a lawyer, and we're able to provide free advice. But it doesn't mean that we necessarily will then take on their case, but we may, it may be that we're referring them to legal aid and explaining how to do that process, or it may be that we're providing them further information about options that they can pursue, or we may decide that we're able to represent them at the clinic. And I'll talk about the kinds of cases we decide to do full representation on. So that's the next one, representation at courts and tribunals. So we are able to represent people with their hearings and on applications that require legal submissions. We also will want to work on systemic litigation. So that's, legal cases that can have an impact on more than just one client, that can make changes to the law. We also participate in other groups to try and advocate for law reform and changes that affect our clients. And we're also hoping to provide mentorship and education to law students and junior lawyers. So our services. So in terms of deciding what kinds of cases, we will do a full representation, like we are the lawyer for the person, and not limited to just summary advice. We have to really think about how to prioritize our service. And as I say, it's only on in litigation, so in hearings in court, or applications that need legal submissions. And so we would tend to prioritize cases that are legally complex or involve sensitive client care issues or require immediate urgent action. And so some of the issues that we can work on are judicial reviews at federal court or refugee claims and appeals, inadmissibility cases. So there's all sorts of issues that we can work on, but we have to but we can't say we'll do every one of these because we would just become full immediately. We have to instead prioritize based on the complexity of the case or the urgency of the case, whether we'll decide to take it on as a full rep case. And I think that's where I will leave it, and then I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Lobat, and thanks for giving us an introduction to the Immigration and Refugee Legal Clinic. It's a newer clinic, and I'm not sure if everyone's heard about it yet. So I did put the website in our chat, so everyone can go in there and get more information. I guess the first question would be, how do other organizations refer to you?
Oh yeah, good question. So yeah, you can contact us. That's the phone number, and or you can email info@irlc.ca. There's also on the website a form an intake form. So whichever way is best, you could do the intake form, you can write an email, you can send, or you can call. We also have access to interpreters. So if the client needs an interpreter for the meeting with the lawyer, we'll book interpreters for that. Oh, Bahar, you're on mute.
Here we go. Okay, great. So our next question is, do you have any updates for the new measure for asylum healthcare workers who have been working during the COVID-19 to get PR?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me pull this up. There hasn't been a ton of information. The government issued a press release last week saying that they were going to have a pandemic worker program. So I'm just going to kind of set out the criteria that were in the press release. But in terms of, there hasn't been more information about how one actually applies. It is a new public policy that the government's creating. So it's for those who've claimed asylum before March 13th, 2020, that have who've been issued a work permit and that they've worked in the healthcare sector. And then this is the part where I think there's going to be more information about, in particular, what types of occupations count. But they're saying worked in the healthcare sector between March 13th, 2020 and August 14th, 2020 for no less than 120 hours. And then meets the admissibility requirements. I can, Bahar, I'll find the link to that press release and put it in the chat box if you want.
Great, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think if you have clients that have worked, nurses, aides, these are the kind of occupations they've listed here: patient service associates, assistant orderlies, certain home support workers. Then yeah, they should stay tuned, because this might be an easier way for them in terms of a path to PR. And as far as we understand, it's not in the press release, but I understood that it also includes failed claimants, and that there are no application fees for making it. But as I say, none of that is, I don't have a document to point you to, and we're waiting for more details. I don't know if Katya has other information about that she wants to share. Okay.
No, I don't. Yeah, I actually just got contacted by a client this week who like heard about it and she qualifies for it. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, let's wait until we know what to do, because
it's not clear. It's not clear yet, but it's good news that there's something, but I don't not all the details are out yet.
Okay, great. Someone's asking if we could go back one page on Lobat's presentation. Maybe one more here, I think. This one. Yeah. Okay, great. So we'll just leave that up. Okay. We have another question. Does the public policy apply only to those who claimed refugee status, or does it include those who came as TFWs and who have become undocumented workers now?
As far as I understand, it's for claimants.
Oh.
Yeah, that's what I understood. I mean, they may announce a different program for that, but that's what I understood that press release was about.
Okay, so they basically haven't released too much details. You're basically
I'm going by what it was like a week and a half ago or something that they announced. but they haven't, as far as I know, they haven't provided, you know, any information about how do you actually apply.
This question I think is for Katya. What type of proof would be sufficient to send in for the PR application if a couple is not married? For example, common law but have children and the spouse is out of the country.
You don't, right off the bat, you don't need to provide anything. Usually you would have listed your dependent spouse and children at the beginning of your refugee claim as your family members. There are some countries, I don't see it for all of them, but Colombia is an example where they might ask for a declaration of common law status. So, and they would outline what they need, but I've seen them like, you know, ask for WhatsApp messages or online messages, photos that shows that you were a couple previous to, you know, to the PR application. So they may ask for it, they may not. And I think, again, it depends by country. So regardless of you know, each PR case is different. So they might ask specific documents for you that they ask for somebody else, but not for you. So yeah, you basically just have to wait and see what specifically RCC is asking you for.
Okay, right, okay. It says, okay, I'll come back to that question actually. Oops, what am I doing here? Okay. And another question for Katya was, does SOS support clients in Vancouver Island, like if they call in?
No, our mandate, as far as I know, is limited to the mainland. We do see some clients. I have clients who live really far away. There are some organizations in Victoria that do support refugee claimants. So if that's the case, we would usually refer them to them.
Okay, great. And this one's for Lobat. Is it possible to request HNC considerations for a son who is 23 years old when a protected person applies for PR?
Right, I think so because normally for dependents, they have to be 22 or under. So I think the question is about, you know, whether if you're going to be including them in your PR application or applying to sponsor, can you request special humanitarian consideration because they're slightly over age? Yes, you can. You know, it's, you know, you can ask for humanitarian. It may delay the processing of the rest of the application because you're asking for special consideration. And it really depends on, you know, the likelihood of success depends on the circumstances of the case. But yeah, it is possible. Yeah.
We have another question, might be for both of you or Katya. The person received an email about their work permit on March 5th saying that it would take about 6 weeks for the hard copy to arrive, but it still hasn't. So what can they do about their work permit not arriving yet?
You can always, usually when they issue the letter that says you're going to be getting your work permit on such and such date, it means that they've already mailed it out, right? So depending on Canada Post, things are delayed right now because of COVID. It may take, it's usually not 6 weeks, it's usually less than that. But if you haven't received it and you're concerned about it, you can contact IRCC either by phone, which is, you know, a long wait, but you do get to speak to somebody, or online via what's called the web form. And it's a link where you can, you know, just fill out your personal information, the application number, and inquire specifically about it. And usually you hear back within, you know, 10 business days. So the immediate solution would be to call IRCC, but again, they might not give you very specific details, right? If assuming, let's say, that your work permit never arrived, that it might have gotten lost in the mail, you can apply for a replacement of that document as well. Because it has happened, not very often, but in the past it has happened that people just never receive it on the mail.
Okay. And if they don't receive it in the mail?
They can apply for a replacement.
Okay.
Yeah. You would basically say, you know, it's taken more than the stated time. You fill out a very simple form to replace it. It does cost $30, but they usually process the replacement within 1 to 2 months.
And is that something they could call SOS to help with?
Yes, 100%.
Okay, perfect. There was a question earlier about biometrics. So Chita just gave us the link for that. So on the website, it says biometrics collection in Canada. Even though a small number of Service Canada offices may be open with limited services, biometrics collection services are currently unavailable. So
Oh, wow.
there was someone asking about that. Yeah, maybe that'll be updated soon.
As far as I know, that was only for work permits, though, because I do know that a client recently went and gave the biometrics. So I'm wondering if it, you know, what circumstances that was. But one thing that they are doing is, for instance, they're asking for FBI clearance if you've lived in the US, and for that you would go to RCMP, you give your fingerprints and then send them to the US. So that might have been the case.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It says, do you have any information about the new PR pilot project about overseas family members applying at the same time as the family member in Canada?
Yeah, that pilot project, I think, started at the beginning of the year. And basically what they were doing is, at the beginning, if your family was abroad, they only ask for your paperwork, as in your the forms, and later on ask for your family's forms. For anybody over 18, they would have to fill out the same forms that you did with your peer application. But with the pilot project, they were basically asking for everybody's forms together. So anybody over 18, whether they were in Canada or not, you would submit the paperwork together. However, COVID kind of threw a wrench into that. So I honestly don't know if they're still doing the pilot project. My suspicion is that probably not, but it never hurts to send all of the paperwork together if you're able to do so, right? Because they might request it relatively soon anyway.
Another question. Some refugees are reluctant to provide all the information during the claim process for fear that the host country will check the country of origin. Is that the case?
Yeah. Sorry, can you say that again?
Sure. It says, some refugees are reluctant to provide all information during the claim process for fear that the host country will check with the country of origin. Is that the case?
Oh, no, I mean, they're not. In fact, the information that's provided when you make a refugee claim and your hearings in front of the Immigration Refugee Board, that is it's a confidential proceeding, and they're not allowed to, like, board members are not allowed to then go and contact the host country. So no, that isn't a concern with respect to the Immigration Refugee Board.
Okay. A client is asking how long it takes to receive the decision after the hearing.
Yeah, that it's hard to know. So sometimes they give the decision right at the hearing itself, like they provide oral reasons, but most times they do written reasons, and it can totally vary, which is not very helpful. But it could be anywhere from like the next week, or it could be, 3-4 months. I think it's quite odd if it would be longer than 6 months. That's my general sense.
Another question is, would the same apply for refugee claims at the border made by minors?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, if they're unaccompanied, then it's different in terms of, well, first of all, they would fit within the exceptions of the Safe Third Country Agreement because they're an unaccompanied minor. It depends, but if they're with their parents, for example, then no, the same thing applies as we talked about. Yeah.
Another question is, do you have any new information of the change of address to IRB, IRCC, or CBSA?
Katja?
It's back in the day we used to be like, okay, go to the 300 West Georgia and do it in person, but you can actually do it online with IRCC and CBSA via the web form. So there again, this is a portal which you can use to send inquiries to IRCC, and there's actually an option just for contact information, so you can ask IRCC and to share with CBSA your new contact information. With IRB, what I've been doing, and as on their website, there's a contact us link, and at the very bottom, it's kind of like a little chat box that opens up. So that's how I have been sending IRB change of address information. So you can do it online right now. We can't hear you, Bahar.
Okay, there's another question for Katya. Generally, how long does it take to get refugee claimant documents after they apply for it?
It all depends. I mean, it used to be that right when you sent that initial email to IRCC asking for refugee status, they would ask you for very basic information and issue the acknowledgement of claim by email almost right away. Right now, that's not the case anymore. You have to submit all your paperwork, your basis of claim, your background information forms, and then they would issue the AOC, the acknowledgement of claim. So, I mean, it's still, I think if you, have already your lawyer helping you with your basis of claim, as soon as the documents are received via e-post fairly quickly. But again, if it takes you a long time to submit the documents, and that's, it depends on how fast you are.
Okay. The other question we have is about the Refugee Appeal Division. Has there been an extension? You may have mentioned this, Lobat, but has there been an extension of how long claimants have to apply for appeal?
There was a suspension of the processing time. So they basically, the suspension period was from January 1st, 2020 to August 18th, 2020. So none of the timelines applied during that period, but now they're back. So, and actually we're now, we're August 25th. So from August 19th, we're now 6 days into the new counting. So, like if, for example, if you got a decision, a refugee board decision like February 1st, even though that was like a long time ago now, you're still in time to file your notice because we're only 6 days after, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then what about the for those who've lost their income, are refugee claimants eligible for the COVID-19 CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit?
The CERB is not depending on your immigration status. So the criteria is basically you lost your income or your job due to COVID-19, or you're making less than $1,000 a month due to COVID-19. So whether you've been laid off, your hours have been cut, you do qualify for it. One of the other criteria is I think you need to have made at least either $1,000 or $2,000 of income within the past 12 months. So, I mean, it's very flexible. So however, because each case is different, we do encourage people to call Service Canada just to double check their eligibility. Because if that money, it's very easy for them to just give you the money. I actually got it myself because at the beginning we were trying to figure out how it was done. And once the application was available online, I was like, okay, I'll see how it's done so I can guide my clients through it. It was literally 4 questions, and I was like, okay, the money's been deposited to your account. I was like, what? No. So I had to give that money back. And so a lot of people who were not eligible were applying and getting the money. So they're like, okay, if I got it, that means I was eligible for it along. So that's not the case. If you did get that money and you didn't actually meet the criteria, you are expected to give it back by the end of the year. And if you did apply for it and it was determined later on, CRA and Service Canada are reviewing those applications, and it's determined that no, that money, you weren't qualified to receive it to begin with, you are expected to give it back at the end. I think that will happen at tax time. And it's also taxable income. So it's not dependent on your immigration status, it's dependent on your working situation prior to COVID. That's what matters.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have we have a couple more questions. Because of COVID, would there be a chance for persecuted people to be able to make a claim at their country's embassy?
I don't think there's any changes to that you have to be out of country. Like, is that, I don't know if that's what they mean.
Yeah, like I think that's what it means. Like they have to be out of the country, right, to make the refugee claim.
Yeah.
One more question. Does the refugee claimant document still come without a photo, as it wouldn't be considered an ID without it?
No, actually, it never comes without a photo. The thing that comes without a photo that looks very similar is the work permit. It's like the same format, it's yellow, it's the same, but it doesn't have a photo. The reason why you're not issued your refugee protection document when you first send that email to IRCC is because you need to have the interview, and then they'll take the photos and issue the document. So that's why they're not giving it right away, and that's why you have to wait for your interview to be issued that document.